Okay. Well, hi there, everybody. I am Mandy Askins. I'm the Assistant Collections Manager for the Cincinnati Observatory Center. So my day job, I manage the collections and artifacts, but I also do history programming. So tonight we're going to talk about the mythology of eclipses, history, science, and fiction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get this up and get the presentation started. There we go. And obviously, we just had this total solar eclipse just in, I wanted to say, is it last month? Yeah, I guess it was last month. It almost feels like it's June. And, we've been talking a lot about not just the science of eclipses, but, the history surrounding it. The last programs, we talked about some of the expeditions that observatory directors had taken over time to chase the eclipse. And as someone who is a kind of a self-proclaimed sci-fi nerd. I have my Doctor Who in the background. I really wanted to kind of delve into like some historical accounts, like ancient and mythology, as well as in science fiction. So we're going to kind of go through some of those tonight. And really, when we think about mythology, we think often of like Greek and Roman gods, but there's obviously tons of cultures and a lot of other gods and goddesses. But in many cultures throughout human history, the sun was an entity of supreme importance, crucial to existence. The sun gives life itself, and people regularly worshipped it as a god or a goddess. The god Amun-Ra to the Egyptians, Helios to the Greeks, and the goddess Amaterasu for the Japanese. One reason the sun kind of served as a god or a goddess in so many cultures was its awesome power. Looking directly at it would severely damage the eyes, which only kind of gave more power to that sun deity's wrath. The idea that a total solar eclipse could temporarily extinguish the sun or life inspired a lot of imaginative kind of explanations on what that means, really before we understood the science and what an eclipse does and how we're able to actually predict it now. Most of these kind of stories involve some kind of evil entity trying to devour the sun. An eclipse, even lunar, also often looks like something's taking a bite out of something. When I took my kids to see the total solar eclipse last month, we used the Pac-Man, he's kind of eating the sun kind of thing. And a lot of these myths arose just from the fact that, the early stages of the solar eclipse, it does look like there is that bite taken out of it. Eskimos thought the eclipse meant the sun and the moon had become temporarily diseased. And in response to that, they would actually cover up everything like crops and agriculture themselves. They would protect themselves so that then they would not become diseased. They thought that the actual rays of the eclipsed sun could infect them. Various Native American tribes in the Great Lakes thought that the onset of a total eclipse represented an extinguished sun. So to prevent permanent darkness, they would fire flaming arrows at the sun in an attempt to rekindle it. So we're going to talk about a couple of, mythological kind of things. And it's difficult to say mythological because obviously these are also rooted in history and deep in culture. So we're going to talk about a few of them. The first one is the Bakunawa, which I love saying that word, but it's a serpent-like dragon in the Philippines, in Philippine mythology. And it was often known as the eclipse bringer. And here you can see, kind of an artistic rendering of the Bakunawa, as well as some historical drawings where, the Philippines is obviously they're an island nation, they're a seafaring nation. So boats were designed as this serpent who could potentially cause eclipses, earthquakes, rain, and wind. Kind of an all-around natural disaster bringer, I guess, so to speak. And the movements of the Bakunawa served as the geomantic calendar system for the ancient Filipinos, part of the rituals of the Babylonian priestess, and it's usually depicted, as you can see here, with the characteristic kind of looped tail and a single horn on the nose. And genuinely, it was believed to be a sea serpent, but that also inhabited the sky or the underworld. So he was kind of all over the place and could bring among lots of different what we now know as natural phenomenon. Next up is Dewi Ratty. So this is a Hindu lunar goddess. So we'll talk about solar and lunar, gods and goddesses and mythology and such. She was worshipped in Java and Bali, and pretty well known for her beauty, and also known as the goddess of beauty. Her myth is linked to mostly lunar eclipses, and the moon really plays an important part in Balinese culture, especially in its folklore, its agriculture. Both the full and the new moon hold very special meaning, so much so that if a religious celebration falls on either, the ceremonies are considered auspicious and extended for several days. So it's definitely special if it falls on a full or a new moon. So there's one story, so to speak, or version that explains that the Hindu demon, Kala Rao, sneaked into the fountain of eternal life by pretending to be a god. But he wasn't too clever for Vishnu, one of the main Hindu gods. Kala Rao, his punishment, death by beheading. The story's twist is that before Vishnu severed his head, Kala Rao managed to sneak a sip from the magical fountain, granting eternal life to just his head. Kala Rao happened to then be in love with the beautiful moon goddess, Dewi Ratty. And his kind of intense demonic love was a dark obsession. And he tried as he continued, and still to this day, a lot of these stories, we will see that cyclical, that repeat of solar and lunar eclipses, and that repeat of these stories going over and over. That he would consume Dewi Ratty in the night sky. And often he's successful, sometimes, which maybe could indicate a partial eclipse. But it never really lasts long because Kala Rao doesn't have a body, but Dewi Ratty escapes soon after she is swallowed. And then again, that cycle repeats. And then till the next time that she's captured. We recently had the Miyamiya Center present on the Miami culture experience of the night sky. And, often stories are told only at specific times. So if there's a full moon or a new moon, or at different seasons of the years, you can see a lot of these stories in the night sky. Just even now with current, Western astronomy and constellations, we have, all these Greek and Roman constellations that have these stories attached to them. Next up, we're going to talk about Norse mythology. So here we have Skoll and Hati and Sol and Mani. So Skoll and Hati are two mighty wolves within Norse mythology. And they are kind of the embodiments of this kind of relentless pursuit. So it seems very similar to Dewi Ratty as well. There's always this kind of something chasing and something devouring, and then that cycle repeats. Their names are very foreboding, with Skoll meaning treachery and Hati meaning he who hates. Skoll hunts the sun, who's personified by the goddess Sol, while Hati chases the moon, personified by the god Mani. Their unending pursuits across the sky is kind of a daily spectacle in the Norse cosmos, representing the dichotomy between light and dark and day and night. It's a perpetual cycle, a chase without end until Ragnarok, the foretold doom of the gods. And that's when they said that they will finally catch their celestial prey. So Sol traverses the heavens in her chariot, and you can see that there kind of on the screen of that artist rendering of Sol in her chariot, which is guided along the sun's path across the sky. However, this journey is often not without peril, as I mentioned, that Sol is pursued by Skoll, who is this wolf that's sought out to devour her and plunge the world into darkness, into an eclipse. Similarly, Hati, another wolf, sought to capture Sol's brother Mani, the moon. And this internal struggle between light and darkness. Conversely, when Skoll briefly catches up to Sol during a solar eclipse, it signifies this kind of momentarily victorious victory of darkness, which the Vikings believed then that would foreshadow Ragnarok, or the end of the world. So we have a lot of these kinds of ideas that eclipse, we think about the sun and the moon, that we, if we had never viewed an eclipse, especially a solar eclipse, a total solar eclipse in our lifetime, that this is this really important signifying thing. We know that the sun rises every day. It brings us life. We can expect that. And then all of a sudden it goes away in the middle of the day. To a lot of cultures, that, I mean, is very understandably scary, especially if the stories weren't recorded, or if, a culture did not record that eclipses happened, or that on what date, or possibly a date. Then future generations didn't know that their ancestors had experienced this. So to them, it's new, and it's, how else is that explained? And then we're going to talk about, there's a kind of an artist rendering of Seoul, which I think is quite beautiful. This is probably one of my favorite stories. Hi, I know they're the drunk astronomers. I made a joke in my Friday lecture, because we had our brand new astronomer, Dr. Wes Ryle, in there. And I said, I don't know, are all astronomers drunk astronomers? But, it is nighttime when they're all out. So who knows? But Hi and Ho, it's kind of this story is told in one of the 5 classics of Chinese literature. It's held in the Book of Documents, which is a collection of rhetorical prose attributed to heroes and villains of ancient China. So for over 2,000 years, it served as the foundation of Chinese political philosophy. And within the Book of Documents, there's an anecdotal reference. So again, part mythology, part history. Stories are told over time. If any of us have played telephone as we were as a kid, we know those stories change a lot over, if people keep having to repeat them. But this anecdotal reference to Hai and Ho, they were apparently ancient Chinese royal astronomers who had the responsibility of predicting eclipses for the kingdom. In addition to keeping track of solar, lunar, and planetary motions, they also had the duty of explaining what they meant to that ruling emperor at the time, Chun King. There's some kind of conflicting dates, which we'll also talk later on about, like Homer's Odyssey and such as well. It's really always difficult to kind of pinpoint dates, but now with the data that we have, we can kind of look back and say, well, we know that a solar eclipse happened here, so maybe the story was around this time. So it's somewhere between 2165 BCE to 1948 BCE, but most historians and astronomers agree it was probably on October 22nd, around 2134 or 2137 BCE. Again, I can't tell you why those dates are specific, but somewhere around that time. In either year, if it did happen on either predicted year, it would have made it the second earliest written record of a total solar eclipse. So according to this legend, Hai and Ho knew that a solar eclipse was imminent. But on the day of the predicted eclipse, they were too drunk to perform the sacred rites that included chanting, beating drums, and shooting arrows into the sky at the dragon that was devouring the sun. So we can see a little dragon here devouring the sun. And again, that theme of something devouring and eating the sun. So when the eclipse did take place, the Emperor Chun King, also known as the Son of the Sky, was caught completely off guard. He was never given the advance notice that he needed or wanted in order to dispatch the royal archers. So to fling the arrows at the dragon that was consuming the sun. Because of their failure to inform the Son of the Sky of the impending solar eclipse, Hai and Ho were beheaded for creating confusion in the celestial chain and leaving their functions unperformed. I also made a joke to our new astronomer that, we don't fire at the observatory, we behead, which is a total joke, but I don't do that. Can't be able to perform his duties. They were executed in conformity of the decree, whosoever advances the march of time shall be put to death. And whosoever retards it shall also be put to death. So it seems like you really can't win there with either one. And their epitaph would read, "Here lies the bodies of Ho and Hai, whose fate, though sad, is risible, being slain because they could not spy the eclipse which was invisible." So, yeah. So I think it's a lot easier to be astronomer now. I don't think we behead astronomers. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about history. And it's interesting because not this story of Tecumseh, and which I have just a little bit on it, of the 1806 eclipse, it's not verified. It's difficult because when we think of history written in 1806, especially of Native American tribes in Ohio or throughout the United States, those stories are often, most of them are recorded by the white men. So actually hearing Tecumseh's view of it, we do have some of that. A lot of things are very kind of skewed, and then we also have to think of translations as well. But often, at least here in Ohio, I was taught this as a kid. And when we learn Ohio history in the 3rd and 4th grade, that the 1806 eclipse was kind of often dubbed Tecumseh's eclipse. And it was mostly due to the fact that the story goes that it was predicted by a Shawnee prophet. And its appearance aided unity among the indigenous people of North America. So again, I couldn't actually find as much information on it as I really wanted to. I found this drawing, this rendering of the 1806 eclipse from a repository of a college here in Ohio. Obviously, there's a picture of Tecumseh as well. So again, eclipses often kind of culminate with various historical events and figures. And here in a second, we'll talk a little bit about how it either leads people to battle or to end battles. So Homer's The Odyssey. I have not read this since I was in high school. I'm a modern historian. So I have to kind of retell the story from other things that I've read because I had forgotten about it. But it references a solar eclipse on April 16th, 1178 BCE, near Ithaca, which was Odysseus's kingdom. And it's the nearest solar eclipse that can be associated with the fall of Troy. Researchers say that references to planets and constellations in the Odyssey describe a solar eclipse. We'll also find this in other petroglyphs and cave paintings where it looks like they are inferring or documenting an eclipse, but again, we can't be for sure. So in the Odyssey, it describes a solar eclipse that occurred in 1178 BCE, about 3 centuries before Homer is believed to have written the story. And if this is correct, the finding would suggest that the ancient poet had a surprisingly detailed knowledge of astronomy, which I don't think that, when we look at Greek and Roman history, that's not something that's surprising. They were pretty well educated, especially in the realms of astronomy. The Odyssey, is commonly dated to around 800 BCE, and it describes the 10-year voyage of the Greek general Odysseus to his home on the island of Ithaca after the fall of Troy, around 100 BCE. So towards the end of the story, a seer named, and again, if I pronounce this wrong, I apologize, Theoclymenus prophesies the death of a group of suitors that are competing for the affection of Penelope. The wife of Odysseus, who is believed to be dead, Theomenicles, delivers his prophecy as the suitors are sitting down for their noontime meal. He foresees them entering Hades, and his speech ends with the statement, "The sun has been obliterated from the sky, and an unlucky darkness invades the world." Then Odysseus dispatches the suitors not long after. So around the Greek scholars Plutarch and Heracles advances the idea that Theomenicles' speech was actually a poetic description of an eclipse, and they cite references in the story that date the prophecy was at a new moon, which would be true of an eclipse. And later in 1920, researchers speculated that Homer might have had a real eclipse in mind when he's writing this, after calculating that a total solar eclipse would have been visible on April 16th, 1178. So now taking the data that we know now and looking at these old stories saying there are some, there's validity to some of this. So they around the Ionian Islands where Homer's poem was set. Kind of makes me want to go back and read it again, maybe. We'll see. I don't know. My son's taking Latin next year, so we'll see what he's assigned. Okay. Let's see. did I? Oh, there's my notes. So the Battle of the Eclipse, which I think is a really cool name for a battle. It reminds me of a Russian battle, the Battle of the Ice, because it was on the ice. But the Battle of the Eclipse was in 6th century BCE between the Medes and the Lydians. And Herodotus, we know Herodotus was a historian. And again, when one man is writing, but it's not quite like history that we have now, where things are cited, it's just kind of his recorded histories of what he knew politically and socially was going on at the time. But he writes in the 6th year of the war, the Lydians and the Medes were engaged in decisive battle. These battles went on, I think it was like 6 or 7 years or longer. So during one battle, day turned into night. And it led both parties to halt the fighting and negotiate a peace agreement. But unfortunately, after the eclipse ended and they had a peace agreement, then the fighting just continued. So it didn't really do anything spectacular. But at least at that kind of moment of time, they were able to have a peace. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's Christopher Columbus. So I've been told this story a couple of times and I have a lot of information on it. But, I think Christopher Columbus sometimes is a difficult historical figure to talk about, especially when, we talk about him discovering the New World and a lot of, what colonialism meant. So this story is, not, it's definitely indicative to the times and how Columbus treated the people that he encountered. But essentially, in October of 1492, Columbus came ashore on an island northeast of Cuba, which was he later named San Salvador, or known as Holy Savior. Over the next 10 years, he would make 3 more voyages to and I like to use the quote, New World. And on his 4th and final voyage, while exploring the coast of Central America, Columbus kind of found himself in a really tight spot. His boats weren't really, there were holes in the boats due to shipworms eating the holes. And then he was forced to abandon 2 of his ships and finally had to beach his last 2 ships on the north coast of an island now known as Jamaica in 1503. So we know that he's had all these travels all in and around here, but he ends up getting stranded. He was with the native peoples, the Arawak Indians. And at first they were really welcoming. They exchanged food and shelter, but then kind of the days drags into weeks and months. And, we can only imagine, in reading history what happened. Finally, after being stranded for more than 6 months, half of Columbus's crew mutinied, robbing and murdering some of the Arawaks, who themselves had grown weary of supplying them of food and shelter and all of that for really kind of not goods. What are they going to do with tin whistles and trinkets and goods that aren't really good for survival? And then it really kind of looked like famine was going to happen. So Columbus kind of comes up with this idea. And, we still to this day use nautical and astronomical almanacs. They're still published. They've been published for even during Columbus's time for a long time. The observatory has ones dating back to, early to mid 1800s almanacs, knowing when and where the stars are going to be, and also predicting things like lunar and solar eclipses. So he had this almanac, and he then ended up finding out that on the evening of Thursday, February 29th in 1504, a total lunar eclipse would happen, right around the time of moonrise. So knowing this, 3 days before the eclipse, Columbus asks, to talk to the chief of the tribe and informs him that his Christian God was very angry with his people for no longer supplying him with food and, him and his men with food and shelter and all of that. So therefore, this Christian God would show displeasure, and that in 3 nights hence he would but all obliterate the rising full moon, making it appear inflamed with wrath, which would signify the evils that would soon be afflicted on all of them. So obviously on that evening, the sun sets in the west, and the moon started emerging beyond the eastern horizon. And it was pretty obvious that something was happening. By the time the moon appeared in full view, a small but noticeable kind of dark scallop, or we obviously know that little bite, that crescent, had been removed from its lower edge. Just about a half an hour as evening twilight ended and full darkness descends, the moon, kind of becomes that, you get that like kind of inflamed, like the bloody appearance, that red moon kind of looking appearance. And, instead of a normal winter full moon, there now hung a dim red ball in the eastern sky. So Columbus, and then this is documented by Columbus's son Ferdinand, that the tribe was pretty terrified. And they promised that they would happily, oblige Columbus with whatever he needed. And Columbus was like, well, I have to go think about it. So he went to his, room area, whatever, for 50 minutes. And while in his quarters, apparently he had this hourglass where he would turn it every half an hour to time the various stages of the eclipse based upon the calculations of this almanac. And just moments before the end of the total phase, he reappears, announcing to the Arawaks that his god had pardoned them and would now allow the moon to gradually return. So it's kind of like a magic trick. Like he's trying to be a magician here, in order to get food and shelter after treating these people pretty horribly. So, it ended up being where these people ended up, supplying and feeding Columbus's men until he was able to get a relief ships to come and, I guess, so to speak, rescue them. And then, yeah, so it's an interesting story. It doesn't, it can't make you like Christopher Columbus anymore. But it is kind of interesting to know that, we have this knowledge of when lunar and solar eclipses will happen, but there are these cultures that don't. But yet he chose to exploit them for that. Okay, so we're going to talk about a little bit of sci-fi, and there were so many other topics I wanted to include in this. And I was drawing a blank, as someone who has consumed a lot of science fiction for the last essentially 30 years. I forgot about a lot of them, and thankfully audience members and Friday reminded me of a couple. But we're only going to talk about two tonight. One of my favorites is A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Apparently Homer's Odyssey was also kind of a the eclipse being talked about in that inspired parts of Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. So if you haven't, read it or seen it, which apparently I really need to like rewatch this movie. Hank is kind of the main character in this book. And he's ridiculed at King Arthur's court for his kind of strange appearance. Obviously, he's wearing clothes that are not of the time. And he is sentenced by them, particularly the magician Merlin, to burn at the stake on the 21st of June. And then Hank realizes that this date coincides with a historical eclipse in 528, of which Hank had learned in his earlier life. While in prison, he sends the boy, whom he apparently names Clarence, whose real name is not Clarence. It's Amias de Poulet, which is funny because Le Poulet is, chicken. To inform the king that he will blot out the sun if he is executed. Hank believes it's the 20th of June. However, it's actually the 21st. So it's actually the day of the eclipse when he makes this threat. And the eclipse occurs around 12:03 p.m. When the king decides to burn him, the eclipse catches Hank by surprise. So he didn't realize that it was the day of the eclipse. However, quickly he convinces the people that he caused it. And he makes a bargain with the king, is released, and becomes the second most powerful person in the kingdom, which sounds very similar to the Christopher Columbus story, but Hank was just trying to save himself, not not exploit people to the extent of Columbus did. But it's kind of a funny story. So the lesson learned is that if you ever have to travel back in time, remember when all of the eclipses are, so then you can just kind of, it's like your get out of card. So that's the That's the moral of the story. And then next up, I guess, on science fiction is Asimov, Isaac Asimov, one of my favorite authors. I was kind of just looking up, fiction and eclipse, and I had never heard of this story. And thankfully, I kind of came across a compilation of his short stories in a used bookstore recently, and was able to read it. It's only about 35 pages long. And yeah, you can find it online if you want to read it. And Nightfall is set on a distant world called Lagash. It orbits 6 suns, which leaves it kind of bathed in perpetual sunlight, except for maybe a couple rare occasions in which all of the suns set at the same time. And then a group of scientists from a university there have made a number of discoveries. Ancient civilizations that rise and abruptly fall every 2,000 years. This is a theme in a lot of Asimov's books. We look at the Foundation series, the idea of the rise and falls of empires. And at the same time, there's a cult, also another theme of a lot of Asimov's books, has arisen that believes a coming darkness that will destroy the world in fire. As the story opens, only a single sun is visible in the night sky, or in the sky. Beta was at zenith, and its ruddy, end quote, Beta was at its zenith, its ruddy light flooding the landscape to an unusual orange as the brilliant rays of setting gamma died. Beta was at Athlon. It was small, smaller than Theramon had ever seen before, and for that moment, it was indisputed the ruler of Lagash's sky. So there ends up being just kind of one lone sun in the sky. And then during the story, one scientist explains to a reporter that years before they had discovered an anomaly with its orbits of the planets and suns, which led them to theorize and later discover the existence of an undiscovered moon that orbited the planet, which would soon then block out Beta, leaving the planet bathed in darkness for hours. The eclipse does indeed come, and it brings the darkness of the whole planet, revealing stars to the inhabitants for the first time. So imagine never seeing stars. We only see sunlight all the time. And then it leads to the collapse of society once again. So I notice in a lot of these stories, even with science fiction, it's that cyclical, we think of orbits and that kind of cyclical meaning of eclipses and everything like that. So apparently Asimov was inspired by this quote by Emerson here. And his editor had said, instead of, why don't you move it to it being a planet that's completely in sunlight all the time, and then it's all of a sudden bathed in darkness. So there's some kind of memoirs of Asimov when he wrote these short stories. So I do definitely recommend reading it. Again, it's about 35 pages long. So it's definitely written in typical Asimov story writing. Reminds me a lot of Foundation and others, but it's definitely worthwhile to read. Probably would make a really good movie as well. So when I was talking on Friday as well about it, we're talking about eclipses and science and fiction and history, but then we kind of have to think about what are we doing now to learn more about the sun. Obviously, we can view the sun a lot better during a total solar eclipse, but we also do have a lot of spacecraft. So here's a NASA picture of various space probes and solar observatories that are currently or have been out near the sun to explore it. And this is through the heliophysics division studies, which or heliophysics division of NASA, which studies the nature of the sun and how it influences the very nature of space. So, in turn, the atmospheres of planets, the technology that exists there, we know that space is, not completely empty. Instead, we live in this extended atmosphere of an active star. So, when we think of the sun, we kind of take it for granted, but it's an active star. And our sun sends out these, particles and energy, the solar wind, we require, it's our magnetic system is, dependent on the sun as well. So studying it is quite important. If we have no sun, we have no life on Earth. So studying this system not only helps us kind of understand just how the universe works, but also to protect our technology in space. When we think of, technology, the actual spacecrafts, but the astronauts, it's radiation, and kind of all that solar energy as well. How do we protect our equipment? Which I'll talk about here in a second, but I'll be giving a talk later this year about space nuclear technology. So we actually have nuclear powered spacecraft in space, and those also have to be, it has its own radiation, but it also has to be protected by the radiation from the sun. And we have a lot of satellites out in space now, so understanding how the sun works also helps us protect people on Earth, but also what we have in space in our communication. And then also maybe the potentially of the the habitability of humans on other planets in the universe. So then we have Artemis. I love talking about the Artemis program, which I definitely will talk a little bit more about it at another presentation this fall. Artemis is NASA's program. It's an effort to put astronauts back on the moon, which we haven't been there since Apollo 17 in 1972. And it's interesting that it's taken us this long to attempt to try to put people back on the moon again. We've obviously done it quite a few times, but the first phase of Artemis has already been accomplished. And here you can see a picture of the Orion module viewing the Earth and the moon from the lunar orbit during the first Artemis mission. Its objectives involve using the moon as a stepping stone for a mission to Mars. So the idea, it's kind of like a landing pad to eventual Mars exploration. So far, all of them have been unmanned, but the second phase of Artemis, which is planned for, did I forget that? I don't have it here. I believe it's 2025. I think it's next year, because 2022 was when the first round of Artemis missions, which was a successful test of the Space Launch System with Orion, and it placed the Orion into lunar orbit and then returned to Earth. So we've learned now to, obviously studying the moon is important. That's a huge part of, we think about our waves and just, again, the sun and the moon working together. So it's important to kind of understand the moon, but also it's if we're going to live anywhere else, at least, the moon's the quickest and easiest to get to. All other planets are kind of far away, so we don't quite have those capabilities. So I think it's important to kind of understand where we've come from and where we're going now. So hopefully Artemis is successful. And who knows, maybe my grandchildren or great grandchildren one day will have colonies on the moon. The sci-fi enthusiast in me hopes for that. I think that would be very interesting. But I do thank you guys tonight for listening to this program about some mythology and history of eclipses. And I would be happy to take questions if there are any.